Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Computational Photography, why your smartphone takes better pictures than your big camera with Gary Friedman. I am Trevor Pogson of the RPS Digital Imaging Committee. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all 268 of you. We're glad to see so many of you taking the time to be with us today. In addition to members of digital imaging, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and non-members from all over the world. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you'll know how to take part in today's event. For today's event, we have turned on closed captioning for the benefit of the people who need it. You can switch it on or off using the live transcript icon at the bottom of your screen, unless you're using a tablet. If you are using a tablet and want to turn closed captions on or off, please send us a message using the Q&A icon and we'll send you the instructions. This Zoom event has a special question and answer feature. At the bottom of your screen, or possibly the top if you're using a tablet, you will see a Q&A icon. You can click on this to ask a question at any time during the presentation. At the end of Gary's presentation, there will be time for him to answer your questions. Now, his presentation will be so good that you will immediately want to thank him for it. But please don't. There will be an opportunity for your feedback after the event. So please, for today, questions only. Gary will answer as many of your questions as time permits. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Gary Friedman. He is a professional photographer who has traveled the world with his cameras and runs the stock image website friedmanarchives.com. He has written several ebooks on specific cameras, Sony, Fujifilm and Olympus brands, all aimed at explaining every feature with clarity and humor. His photography and writing has been published in magazines, newspapers and books worldwide, and he is the associate editor of Cameracraft magazine in the UK. He was listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for building the world's smallest telephone way back in 1980, long before cell phones or cordless phones were around. Before graduating to photography, he was a rocket scientist for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where he worked on the Voyager and Galileo spacecraft. And he patented the image authentication system now used in high-end digital cameras from Canon and Nikon. As we hand over to Gary, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions, which will be answered after the presentation. So Gary, over to you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gary Friedman. I'm going to do a share screen really quickly. Let me talk about a little bit what we're going to talk about today. Digital cameras, of course, have gotten really good, and our cell phones have gotten ridiculously good. In fact, there are features on this that are going to be trickling up to the big cameras before too long. And let me share with you a couple of examples of that. Because I get emails every day from really frustrated photographers. I shoot with the big cameras, and then my significant other takes out their iPhone and takes the picture, and it's as good as if I had shot in RAW and post-processed later. Humph. I am a stock photographer. I run the stock imaging website friedmanarchives.com, and you can feel free to peruse over there. I also, in addition to that, I'm going to skip that one for a second. I also write ebooks on mirrorless cameras from Sony, from Fujifilm, and from Olympus. My latest ebook is this one from the Sony A7 IV. These are not lightweight books because the cameras are ridiculously complex. This one's 750 pages. My books are renowned for being very thorough and very understandable. People like reading my stuff because I can take a complex subject and explain it very well. By the way, this is what I looked like 2 weeks ago before the grandkids came over and shaved off the beard. But that's a whole other story. In addition to that, I'm an associate editor of Cameracraft magazine in the UK. This is a much better quality print than National Geographic. We try to have very thoughtful works and technical insights you're just not going to find anywhere else because we're not beholden to our advertisers. If there's a really crappy lens that somebody sent out for review, we're going to say so. One other thing, I also, it was mentioned, I worked for 10 years for NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I did a lot of technical work there, and that's why some people feel that my writings are, anyway, what I'm trying to say is I can explain the technical side in a way that most technical people can't. So I'm known for that. But enough about me. Um, in the olden days, if you were a really good photographer, you knew exactly how to light a subject so that it looked good for the camera, not so that it looked good for your eyes, because your eyes and your camera perceive light differently. In cases like this, you put your subject in shadow, you put a flash on, hopefully you use a diffuser, and you underexpose by about 1.7 stops so it doesn't look like you used a flash. And this is what, these were the skills that a good photographer would bring to the table, and would take years to develop it. And if you really had bad light and didn't have a flash, you would shoot in RAW and post-process later. You would bring down the highlights, and you would bring up the shadows, and hopefully there won't be too much noise in the shadows, and you'll be able to recover bad light that way. Cell phones are different. Cell phones don't require any of those skills. You can shoot in what they call pro mode, which is essentially, here's how it looked to me. And then there's photo mode, where it makes it look like it looked to your eye. Cell phones are now fulfilling the promise that point and shoots have promised ever since the days of the Instamatic, but can never really deliver, because after all, the dynamic range of your film or sensor is this wide, but there's this much light in the real world. So I get emails from all over the world from some of my readers. And a lot of them are really frustrated because they go on trips and they take their really big cameras with the big lenses, and they shoot in RAW, of course. And wonderful landscapes. They're taking pictures, and then their significant other takes out their iPhone, takes a picture, one picture, and it comes out perfectly. And then they post it to Facebook right then. By the time the photographer with the big camera goes home, empties the memory card, processes the RAW, and posts it to Instagram, it's already stale. What's up with that? Why am I spending all my time on this really big, schlepping the big equipment around when it doesn't have to be that difficult anymore? And more important than that, what techniques are the small phones using that the big cameras are not? That's what I'm going to talk about today. It's very, very clever. This is where the innovation is now. So there's only 6 techniques that they use. Well, 7.5, but I'm not going to get too technical. The first one kind of summarizes the frustration that my readers have. I have a great camera. I already read through all this. My photos with pictures. By the time I get home and post it to Instagram, the image is already stale. And we have many examples of this. Here's our image taken with a normal point and shoot, or with a camera in pro mode, and also the camera in normal mode. And the right one is the image straight out of the camera. Why can't the big cameras do that and save ourselves valuable life energy? This story has many different beginnings. Beginning number 2 is the song Kodachrome by Paul Simon. I'm sure a lot of you can remember that. Kodachrome is a big deal. The reason I bring it up is because there's a phrase in the song that says, Kodachrome gives you those nice bright colors that give you the greens of summers, makes you feel all the world's a sunny day. Well, it turns out that wasn't true. A lot of people had a negative reaction to Kodachrome when it first came out, and they would actually put a UV filter in front of their lens to compensate for the enhanced colors that Kodachrome was famous for. These are the colors that Paul Simon was singing about. Yeah, they didn't like it at all. And then decades after that, Fujifilm decided to outdo Kodak and come out with a slide film that made Kodachrome look like black and white. They really enhanced the colors. And it raised the question, well, is it really photography when the final image doesn't represent what the real world actually looked like? Beginning number 3, there's been a lot of innovation in the small camera world. This one I thought was absolute genius. This is the Light L16. It wasn't a phone. It was just this very small, flat camera. And it had 16 different lenses inside. What they did was that every time you take a picture, it will choose a subset of those lenses and then stitch the results together, allowing you to take an image of higher resolution than any one of the sensors could capture by itself. In addition to that, you could also grab parallax information, because if you're shooting from slightly different perspectives, you can also infer 3D. You can create your depth map that way. You can focus retroactively after the fact. None of these sensors were actually 56 megapixels, but by the time you stitch them all together, it was 56. That was the final product. You can infer your 3D. You can refocus after the fact. This was genius. And as I mentioned, the result was better images than what any individual sensor could capture. It turns out it was because it was a startup, they had to use plastic optics instead of glass. The unit was underpowered, not enough horsepower with the CPU, and you had to actually process the images on your computer when you got home, and that software was kludgy and slow and full of bugs. So for a lot of reasons, that idea died in the marketplace, and they didn't have enough money to actually make a new version. But what they did do is they regrouped and said, okay, what can we do? And they decided, let's license our intellectual property. So they did, and they licensed the technology to Nokia, who came out with a Nokia 9, and they took this technology and put it into their PureView. 5 lenses instead of 16. All right, well, it's a cost issue. It wasn't very well received by companies like DxO, who do cell phone analysis for a living. And basically it kind of failed in the marketplace. Oh well. And I thought at that time it was dead, but literally a week ago, there's a cell phone company called Honor. They're not big in the US, and I'm not even too sure if they're big in Europe. But they just recently came out with 4 cameras in the back, and they're arranged in such a way that, yes, they can stitch them together. Yes, they can infer the 3D because they have the 2 lenses a couple of inches apart. The idea is not dead, and I believe that we're going to be seeing this incorporated into future smartphones as the idea gets embraced. Beginning number 4. Now, a lot of you may remember this. When 35mm film was introduced to the world, all the professionals shunned it because, after all, the image quality was awful compared to, big 2¼ inch medium format cameras. That didn't matter because everybody else said, oh, the convenience is so great. Oh, my cameras are smaller. Even though the technically inferior, the world embraced the technically inferior format. And there's a lesson in this for anybody who's into market dynamics. They lied to you when they explained how capitalism worked. The best mousetrap doesn't necessarily get all the market share. Sometimes it's what's convenient and what everybody else is doing. And here's a case of that. Just because it's superior doesn't mean that the market's not going to embrace the other version. Finally, beginning number 5, and I used to give seminars before the pandemic all around the world. It was originally to beginning photographers, but it turns out that experienced photographers the world over flocked to it because they liked the way I explained all the basics. And I showed this slide here to explain how there's a big difference between the amount of dynamic range in the real world and the amount of dynamic range in your camera. And in order to be able to take a picture and show all the details that your eye could see, I had to do something like this. So what you're looking at is a bracketed exposure. I put my camera on a tripod and I bracketed about 30 different stops. And I merged all the different images in Photoshop, so only the visible parts were visible. Okay, that doesn't make sense. The parts you could see were visible. The parts that were blown out were out. The parts where there's no detail in the shadows, that was out. And this shows you what I could see with my eye. I don't know if you can see the mouse on your screen, but outside the patio door, it's a bright sunny day. You can see the details on the plants in the backyard. You can see the detail in shadow under the piano bench over here. All these details were available to my eye. But if you take a picture with the camera, you won't be able to get it all. You'll only be able to get the outside but nothing else. Or you'll only be able to get under the piano bench but nothing else. If you try to take a picture that shows everything, it will look flat and lifeless like this. And this is the reason all of our cameras have a fixed dynamic range of about 6 to 8 stops. Now, yes, raw images can go about 15 stops or so, but they intentionally limit it to about 6 to 8 stops. That's what looks good on a screen. That's what looks good on a print. That's the way George Eastman figured out, yes, this looks the best, even though we're not capturing anything. One day, I would tell my students, one day, somebody will figure out how the eye and the brain are able to perceive such a wide dynamic range and crunch it down in a way that doesn't look flat and lifeless and low contrast like this. Remember that, because my friends, we are nearly there. That day has practically arrived and is in the form of cell phones, believe it or not. Cell phones use about 7.5 different techniques. I'm going to go through the 7.5 techniques really quickly. Well, it will take longer than that. And you're going to ask yourself at the end of this talk, why haven't the bigger cameras done this? And the answer is they will one day. But this is where the innovation started. Technique number one is called pixel binning, which you may have heard about. If you have a 108 megapixel sensor on your cell phone, what pixel binning does is takes all the adjacent pixels and kind of crams them all into one. So instead of, I'm looking for this. Here we have the red pixel, which is divided into 9. It all gets averaged into 1. So you have 108 megapixels and you get a 12 megapixel output. Now, this seems like a ridiculous way to go. Why not start with a 12 megapixel image to begin with? I'm going to mention something which I don't agree with here. You know, what's the benefit to doing pixel binning? Well, the first thing is lowers noise, believe it or not, because you got really tiny pixels. Let me go back. Really tiny pixels in your sensor. And we all know that the smaller the pixel, the higher the noise. Well, if you have many different adjacent pixels, when you average them together, all the random noise goes away and all the information that's common to all 9, that all gets put into 1 pixel. So it actually does lower noise. It's a good technique. The other benefit is it gives you 12 megapixels from 108. Is that a good thing? I don't know. It's not the same thing as downsampling that you do in Photoshop, and it doesn't apply to RAW. Also a good thing and a bad thing, both. And your question now is, why don't you just have sensors with bigger pixels in the first place? The official industry response, which I do not agree with, I think it's marketing bullshit. Pixel binning allows you for smaller phones, no huge camera bump for larger sensors, which kind of breaks down if you think about it. If you had a sensor the same size of what they have in the cell phones, all you have to do is put fewer pixels in there. And then the pixels themselves can be bigger. You don't need to go with the trouble of 108 megapixels, which is ridiculous, and then downsample. So ignore that one. There are actually 2 legitimate benefits to it. The first one is you can't shoot an 8K video if you only have a 12 megapixel sensor. There's more pixels in an 8K video than there is in the sensor, and more pixels are still an option for you if your light is good. You don't have to worry about noise as much. So on a really bright day, you can get maybe a 50 megapixel image in your output. Some cameras and some phones allow you to adjust for that. Technique number 2, they call it machine learning. I refuse to use the word AI because it's not artificial intelligence. What they do is they actually analyze the image. This was taken from Samsung. What they do is you take a picture of people, it recognizes the face, and it does what the Portrait Pro program does on your PC, right? It smooths over the skin a little bit, it whitens the eyes and the teeth a little bit, and it kind of makes it look a little bit more pleasing the way that your brain would like to remember it looking. This is an unfortunate example. I pulled this off of Samsung's website because they're showing you, oh, look at all the analysis we're doing on the images. But if you look at the first image and the last image, to me, they're indistinguishable. They look exactly the same. But that's the kind of analysis that's going on right now. It finds a face, it tries to make things look better. All right, big cameras can do that too if you invoke the feature. What's unique? Technique number 3. And this is a really important one because this spills over to all the other ones. We use something called buffering. Now, if you ever used a mirrorless camera before, you know that every time you use the electronic viewfinder, what the CPU in the camera is doing is shoveling data from the sensor to the electronic viewfinder about 60 times a second. So you can see things in real time. Great. What does it do with that information after it shoves it to the viewfinder if it gets it? Never mind. Great. If you're in a cell phone, it doesn't throw that information away. It buffers it. And it keeps about the last second of images in the buffer. So every time you hit the picture button, the shutter release button on the cell phone, it doesn't actually capture what you are looking at right now. It goes back into the buffer and examines all the pictures and chooses the sharpest one, which is probably going to be very close to what you thought was a decisive moment you were capturing. This way, you avoid a lot of blur that would normally happen with an inexperienced person in low light. It can also sometimes you look at the picture with the best smile because it knows how to look for that now. Now, that may seem like cheating a little bit, but so is shooting and manipulating with Photoshop. We can argue about that all day. But this is an important technique that's going to spill over into all the others. But essentially, you take the picture and it'll go back in the buffer and pick the better one from the last second. This can also be leveraged in a technique called image stacking. And many of you may be familiar with this technique if you've ever done a panorama using a cell phone or a bigger camera, for example. It uses multiple pictures and then lines them up. And in the case of panorama, it lines them up to end to end. Sometimes you have an HDR function. Let me go back here again. There's an HDR function which can, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's say you're shooting a beautiful landscape whose natural dynamic range is much wider than what your camera can capture. Many of the bigger cameras used to have a feature called high dynamic range. And the way it works is this. You invoke the feature through the menu, high dynamic range. I'm going to turn this one on. And I have it, you can set it to what you're essentially doing is bracketing and then telling it how much to bracket. So I'm going to set this one to bracket by 6 stops. Great. So I'm going to take a picture. It's going to take 6 pictures, each bracketing by 1 stop. I'm sorry, 3 pictures bracketing in 6 stops. It will then align the images because I'm shooting with a shaky hand and then merge them together. And it looks kind of flat, kind of low contrast, which is what HDR. Usually with HDR, there's a secondary step you need to do called tone mapping, which cameras never figured out how to do. This is what it's like before the HDR. And that's what it's, in this scene, it admittedly doesn't need HDR, but I'm not outside. And this is what it likes, what it looks like with HDR. It lines it up. You got a low contrast image, reminiscent of that image that I shot of my living room with the piano and the outdoor window. It's flat and lifeless, and the cameras have not figured out how to do tone mapping the same way that our eyes and brain can perceive it. So that's what the image stacking technique does. And it can be used for a lot of different images. I just showed you an HDR example a second ago. In the real world, I go out shooting, and these scenes look perfectly normal to my eye, but not to the camera. And I'm going to just show you really, really quickly. And I got an Android phone here. So whenever you have the camera going, you can shoot it from several different settings. And along the bottom, right at the very bottom of the screen, you see different shooting modes. One's called portrait mode, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. One's called pro mode. Pro mode took the left image in my PowerPoint image. What it does is it takes a JPEG without any post-processing, and then it shoots a DNG file, which is essentially a digital negative. Think of it as raw, that's not exclusive to the manufacturer, and it can be opened up by Photoshop or any other program that adheres to the standard. That's what the pro mode does. The photo mode, which is the standard setting for your cell phone, implies all of the HDR techniques and tone mapping techniques and makes it look like it looked to your eye. That's the image you see here on the right. I never use pro mode anymore. And the reason I don't is because you can actually take the DNG file, put it in Photoshop, and come out with an image that's just as good as the out of camera JPEG that the normal photo mode produces. On the left, we have something with a very wide dynamic range. You're looking inside, you can barely see the image of the stairs through the doorway. And the right image is the way it looked to my eye. That's the way you want to point and shoot your work. Make it look like it looked to me. Here's another example, photo mode on the upper left and pro mode on the lower right. Remember, pro mode takes a raw file and also a JPEG that hasn't been manipulated so it looks good to your eyes. That's just the way it's standard. If you had a point and shoot from 15 years ago, that's what that image would look like. If you take the DNG file and run it through Photoshop, you're going to get something that looks really, really close to what the out of camera JPEG looks like. Well, if the results are just as good, why go to the extra trouble of shooting raw and post-processing? So the cell phones can do something that the big cameras can't. They provide ridiculously large dynamic range without the need to shoot raw and post-process. That's one reason why normal people just love their cell phones, because they don't care about good light. They don't care about dynamic range. All they have to worry about is composition. They don't even worry about that. They can always crop it later on. Technique number 5 deals with merging multiple exposures. Now, this is an ancient technique. Astrophotographers developed this. You take a series of shorter exposures, and then you merge them all in your computer later on. It can be great for star tracking photography. It can be great for simulating a neutral density filter in front of your lens when it's too cold to actually use a neutral density filter and actually try different values, because you never know before the exposure begins how long to do it. So that's a good technique that the cell phones do as well. And it is responsible for a technique called night view. Many different camera manufacturers have different names for it, but it's essentially being able to shoot in ridiculously low light with low noise and not needing a tripod. All these images were taken that way. And I pushed it a little bit further. I started to compare my smartphone with an RX100, which up until the smartphones was like the best point and shoot you can get. Not counting the Ricoh GR3, of course. The Sony RX100 version 7, I would take them side by side in really bad light, and the Samsung S21 would consistently produce images that were more pleasing to my eye and that looked the way I remember seeing it more than the RX100 would. And I really wanted to push this as far as I could because I'm an engineer and I like to push my tools to the limit to understand where the envelope is. Night mode without a tripod is on the bottom. Night mode not enabled. That's how it looked to my eye, actually. The black image is how it looked. That's how dark it was. Turn on night mode, hold your camera really, really steady, and it produced that, which is a very low noise image and was brighter than what my eye could capture. Wow. Want to see something even more impressive? Here is a comparison between the JPEG straight out of the smartphone, which is in the upper left-hand corner, and the processed DNG file, which I shot separately in pro mode. And when I say processed, I opened it up, I right in the shadows in Photoshop, and I don't know if you can see it on your screens. I think I have an enlargement of it here. It's noisy as hell compared to the JPEG out of the camera, which is not at all. This, my friends, is a miracle of engineering. I wish my big cameras could do that. I don't want to schlep a camera everywhere I go, especially when and I'm a travel photographer, okay? I'm tired of it. I have a few more examples also, the iPhone 12 versus the RX100. Now, the way that the big cameras will do image stabilization, by the way, this is the next technique. The image stabilization, they will either physically move the sensor up and down, left and right, in equal and opposite ways to the sensed hand shakiness, or it will actually move a couple of optical elements within the lens to compensate for that. There are actually shakiness sensors inside the camera. It can sense how shaky your hands are, and it can take appropriate action, either moving the sensor or moving an optical element. Guess what? Smartphones don't need to do that. They take advantage of the fact your hand is already shaky. And therefore, if you're really, really shaky, there's going to be a position when your sensor is going to be a little bit higher than the one before, or a little bit lower than the one before. And in other words, without even thinking about it, without even trying, your hand unknowingly is emulating the up and down, left and right of what a physical sensor shaking mechanism is doing. And then the software inside the cell phone looks and says, okay, what can I use for it? Which ones are sharp? How can I use this and then merge them all together and try to come up with something better? Now, if you had told me that you can do all that software without any hardware shaking, I'd say you're nuts. Those programmers and the smartphone companies, including Apple, including Samsung, including a few others, they are geniuses. It's not the hardware and the sensor of the cameras that are doing this phenomenal work. It is the software. And that's why I don't really care too much about, oh, this new phone has a 5 billion pixel sensor on it. I don't care about that. I'm going to buy a phone based on how well it handles high dynamic range and how well it does the tone mapping in the camera. That's what sets it apart. So for shaky hands, it still takes advantage of the 60 frame buffering technique. It will go through and look for the images that are a little bit sharper than the ones next to it, and it'll pull from that. There are other benefits to doing that. Yes, you have the image stabilization feature, but it also enables a higher resolution using a pseudo pixel shift. How in the world does that work? I'll explain it in the next slide. And then there's no Bay or demosaicing if your hand shakiness is exactly right. And again, next slide. So as you may know, sometimes the bigger cameras have a pixel shift feature where you put your camera on a tripod. Let's say you want to take really ridiculously high resolution images with your camera. You put your camera on a tripod and you set it for 200 megapixel mode. The camera will take one image, and the sensor anti-shake functions are so precise nowadays that in addition to being able to move the sensor up and down, left and right to counteract your hand shakiness, The precision is so high, you can move it up 1 pixel or move it sideways 1 pixel. Or in some camera models, you can do it 1/4 of a pixel in each direction. And then you do what the Light L16, that flat camera did. You take the images and you merge them all together and you stitch it together and you get a 200 megapixel image from maybe a 42 megapixel sensor. Pretty good. It's a time-proven technique. And that's what can happen here if you shake your hand in a precise way. If you happen to shake it in just the right way, and the camera can go through and pick out ones where the actual camera is being shifted up and down, left and right by 1 pixel. That is amazing. Part of the other advantage, the other reason the cell phones can do that is because they have much more powerful CPUs inside of them than the bigger cameras do. And that also is going to change. The other nice thing about the lower noise is, let's go back one, no Bayer demosaicing. Now, it's difficult to kind of explain how that works, but this diagram sort of shows it. And again, I hope you can see my mouse on this diagram. You take the first picture, and this is what it looks like. You're exposing for all the pixels in there, but you're not exposing for the very outer layer. And then the camera shifts 1 pixel to the left, shifts 1 pixel up, shifts 1 pixel to the right, all that. What you end up with is the image on the right. 4 different images. Remember, you know, there's twice as many green pixels on your sensor as there are red and blue. So whenever they do pixel shifting, they try to take 2 of the green, 1 of the red, 1 blue, and then they mix it all together. If you look at the way things are stacked on the right, you can see each pixel has a red, a green, and a blue, 2 greens and a blue. So that way you don't have to do demosaicing anymore. You know for a fact the value of every red, green, and blue value for every pixel on that sensor. No demosaicing necessary. Amazing. Technique number 7. And this one is responsible for all of the favorite features that smartphone users love. I'm talking about portrait mode here. Portrait mode emulates, I think I have a slide of it over here. Portrait mode emulates that. Having a really expensive f2.8, what I call a wedding lens, you know, it's $1,000 lenses. And portrait mode does that. So, sorry about that. The way to emulate a very expensive f2.8 lens is to create something called a depth map, where you know how far away all the elements of your picture are. And then you can do the same thing you would normally do in Photoshop. The things that are blackest, which means in this case, the things that are further away from the lens, get more Gaussian blur applied than the things that are whitest. And the more Gaussian blur you apply, the more it looks like you shot with a very expensive lens. I have a lot of examples of that because like normal people, I love this feature. And it doesn't even have to apply to humans as well. You can pretend you're shooting at f1.8 on a bright sunny day and just isolate your subject. Depth maps will help you do that. There's many different ways to create a depth map. This is the one that most people know about. They have something called a time of flight sensor. If you've ever read about this, this is what it is. It sends a laser out. Or sometimes there are other techniques for inferring it, but it essentially times how long it takes for the laser to bounce off the subject and reflect back into the camera. Longer it takes, the further away your subject is. And it does this for every single pixel within the field of view of the camera. That's pretty good. And then it builds, again, these depth maps where the blacker they are, the further away they are, and therefore the more Gaussian blur you'll be able to apply. Now you can do this manually if you want to. Most of the phones that you can shoot with, most of the modern ones, especially the iPhones, they can save their images in a format called HEIF. HEIF is like the next generation of JPEG. Not only does it compress images more efficiently than JPEG does, so you can have an image that's 1/10 the size of a JPEG, and JPEGs were already pretty small. They could also store video. They can also store this depth map along with your image, so that when you open it up in Photoshop, yeah, you can manipulate it with curves and all that. You can crop with it, but you can also apply that depth map and apply Gaussian blur after the fact, knowing this information. Not all of the cameras have a time of flight sensor. Google, for example, they try to be clever. They look at the image, they look at the shadows, and they try to infer what's close and what's far away. And that's why the portrait mode in the early pixel cameras was kind of sloppy around the edges. Anything with a time of flight sensor is actually going to be more accurate. But that's a technique that they use, and that's why HEIF is a valuable thing if you're shooting with your smartphone. Now, only Photoshop would figure out how to open the HEIF files that Sony produces. Maybe next week they'll have. Here's a case where you can have after-the-fact lighting. If you have a 3D map of your subject, you can also create CGI Pixar-like lighting after the fact. And this is an example of how it's done with pixels. Now, as I mentioned, the pixel doesn't have a time of flight sensor. It implies it by looking at the shadows and figuring out, okay, nose must be closer. So this is pretty amazing. 15 years ago, I predicted that whenever you take, the camera in the future will not only take a picture, but it'll also capture the depth information so you can light your subject after the fact. Ha, no more studio strobes. It's all obsolete. This is the future. Now, there's a downside to this. Again, I mentioned, software programming is what sets all this stuff apart. And software programming, sloppy software programming can also be really, really bad. Here's an example of a group shot taken in portrait mode. And it looks okay upon first glance. However, if you look at it really carefully, you'll see the front row, the faces are all sharp. And behind the front row, you start to see blurriness, which is put in by that Gaussian blur. And behind that blurriness is a back row. And by the way, the faces are all sharp. And then behind that, it's all blurry again. So here's a case where a big camera would never, ever have done that, where you only have the faces that are sharp and everything else is blurred. So that's kind of a strange artifact. And it's great for this talk, of course. But that's a downside. You'll get unrealistic pictures sometimes. So I talked about the benefit of the HEIF or HEIC format. It can store the depth map information for you, and then you can use that later on and change your depth of field after the fact. Cool. Now, number 8. This one has not yet been put into cell phones, but I predict they're about 2 weeks away. And this is another technique that Google has pioneered for making up for the fact that the phones have very low resolution sensors, and you don't want to pack high resolution sensors in there because you get more noise. So here's the research they've been doing. You start with a reference image. That's the column on the right. Here's 2 of them, a boy smiling and I guess a sea urchin or a flower or something. Then they lower the resolution to about 256 pixels. And then they feed that into their artificial intelligence software. This is what the artificial intelligence software comes up with in the middle column. They start with the left column, and what they come up with is the middle column, which matches the original image very, very closely. Now, yes, they had to cheat in order to do this. In order for this to work, the algorithms, the way they work is they actually have they train their algorithm for here are common snapshots. Here's what a common portrait looks like. Here's what a common flower shot looks like. Thousands, hundreds of thousands of images. So the AI gets a feeling for here's what a good picture of this type looks like. And then you feed it this and it tries to fill in the details on its own. The downside of this technique is, it only works best if the image you feed it matches its training set pretty closely. But this is the future. And the training sets are going to be better. And yes, there's an Achilles heel to this technique. And that can be found here. When you start to look in. Now, the original image is on the right column. All right. And here we are zooming in on the eye. And here's the original zoom in. Look at the hair. Look at the braidings of the hair. Now, here's the low resolution put in, and then the AI software reconstructs a high resolution version of it. The eye looks great, but look at the hair. It's kind of, I don't even know what the word is, wonky? That's a British term, but I think it applies here. It's not quite right because this detail was not part of the training set, so it doesn't really know what to do. Another example, much more subtle, is here. Again, the right column was the original. The left column is the reconstruction of a 256 pixel image that was fed the algorithm. Looks pretty close, but look at the close-ups of the hair. Actually, the hair doesn't look bad, but the hair is different. Here's what it looked like. Here, the hair looks nothing at all like the hair over here, even though it's quite realistic. Okay, why is this important? conjure up the scene from the movie Blade Runner, right? And this is a famous scene where the guy's looking at an image and he tells the software, his little mechanical assistant, enlarge and enhance. That's what's going on here. The software is enlarging and enhancing, and guess what? It's getting it wrong. How wrong is it? Here's another example. The original image had some letters in it. So this is the original. Again, you downsample it to 256 pixels, feed it to the algorithm, and the left column is what you get. Top one looks all right, but if you start to look at the details, it can't reconstruct the letters at all. So there's a downside to this. And it's always important to know the limits of your tools and what cameras can and can't do. So the drawbacks to the techniques are, it only works best on images that are similar to your training set. And this is absolutely the wrong solution for surveillance cameras, because again, enlarge and enhance. Oh, there's a person committing a crime. We're going to submit this as courtroom evidence. And of course, normal people don't know about this stuff. So you're going to put innocent people in jail when you start to do this. And I've been alive long enough to know that if there's ever a bad application for technology, that's the application that's going to be embraced by society first. So this is the wrong thing for surveillance cameras. That's where it's going to be used first. Mark my words. And I'm guessing that the next generation of cell phones is going to start using this. In fact, there's a suggestion that my cell phone's already using it now, although I can't tell for certain. Here's a couple pictures. I can't tell if these are alpacas or llamas. I'm sorry, I don't know the difference. But look at the texture in the fur, especially a close-up over here. This looks like it was kind of artificially. It looks like either a really bad watercolory JPEG, or they tried to put the fur texture in where there wasn't any. I can't tell, but I'm guessing this technique is about 2 weeks away. Here's another technique where Google is showing off, taking the low resolution image and adding noise. They add random noise to it and get that. Now, what's amazing to me is it's adding details that weren't originally there. Look at the catch lights in the eyes that were not in the original image. This is a mind-blowing technique that they're using, taking the low resolution, adding noise to it, and reconstructing something higher resolution. Now, I thought that they were either blowing smoke or this is just ridiculous. So I started to look at their. By the way, if you want to know how Google did this, they have a really easy to understand paper that they publish, and anybody can go read it. Clear as day. That's how they're doing it. And again, this is what the cell phones are going to be doing around the corner. So that's pretty amazing. And you may be asking yourself, well, yeah, but nothing matches the resolution and quality of a big camera, which is true. But if you're a normal person, and I've had people explain this to me so many times, my readers, like they want to get a big camera, and they say to their significant other, let's get a RX 100 version 7, a point and shoot for our trip. And they say, why? This phone does a great job already, and it fits in my pocket. All right, so what's the big advantage of a big camera? So the obvious one is higher resolution, which means you can make bigger prints. Okay, we all know that. And that's not going to go away. You can add telephoto lenses. You want to shoot sports? A bigger camera is the way to go. And it can track things that are moving toward the camera. The bigger cameras will have a corner on the market for that for a much longer time. As I said, sports photography, great. More control over your details, because we all love, we're all control freaks, right? We have the vision in our head, and the bigger camera will help us achieve that vision. But we have to pre-visualize the outcome first. Helps you with a decisive moment. We all know now that the cell phones, there's no such thing as decisive moment. There's the sharpest moment, which people like better. Flash and wireless flash. That's a big thing for me. I'm a studio photographer. I love wireless flash. And if you're shooting weddings, people will take you more seriously if you're shooting with a bigger camera. And you think I'm joking. Try shooting with an original E-mount camera shooting weddings. No, it's got to be big. It's got to have a really big white lens. The wireless flash part, I always keep a camera in my camera bag. I always keep a wireless flash and a diffuser, because you never know when you're going to be doing portraits on site. You cannot do this with a smartphone. All right, this is wireless flash using high-speed sync. I took this portrait at 11 o'clock on a bright day, outdoors. And here's close-ups. Here's the original. And then we had 2 different volunteers hold flashes with diffusers on them. And I set my shutter speed to about a 2,000th of a second at f9. So the ambient light went to almost 0. And the only light that's showing up here, mostly, is the light from the flashes. And then you zoom in and get rid of all the distracting stuff, and you get that. Daytime, wireless flash. Can't do that with a smartphone. I love wireless flash. It's always with me. It's my secret to getting wow type images. And I've always been telling people in my seminars, if you want to take pictures that make people say, wow, it's not a higher resolution camera. It's not a more expensive lens. It's your light. And with wireless flash, you have a chance to control your light in a way that makes people say, wow, like nothing else. And it's portable and it's affordable. And you don't have to buy really big, expensive soft boxes and the big strobes and the vagabond batteries to go with it. None of that. Okay, I'm getting a little carried away, but you get the idea. And by the way, this is such an important topic for me. This is another Zoom talk I've given to photo clubs around the world. Just saying. The other thing about these smartphones is it doesn't hold up to pixel peeping, which we all know. You know, sometimes the JPEGs out of the smartphone look really, really bad. But normal people do not examine their images this way. Pixel peeping, I've never thought, was a valid way of examining image quality. The right way to do it is to blow it up poster size and view it from a reasonable distance, because that's how humans look at pictures. Nobody pixel peeps. But if you do, it doesn't hold up. Okay. One day, smartphones will catch up. So why not do these techniques on big cameras? The answer is, I predict that's exactly what's going to happen next. Mirrorless cameras are already starting to sample 60 frames per second to shovel the data from your sensor to the electronic viewfinder. And so it's already got that technique going on. All it has to do is buffer it and apply a little bit more intelligence. Maybe put a stronger CPU in there. I don't know. Nobody asked me. Graft the smartphone CPU and algorithms into the big cameras, and we'll be in photographic heaven. We're already starting to see examples of that. Oh, I just said that. We're already starting to see examples of this. The newly announced OM1 from a camera company formerly known as Olympus. They're starting to do this already. They have multi-shot neutral density. Remember that shot of the waterfalls I showed you about a third of the way through the talk? They can do that in camera. A live composite. I've always loved this about Olympus. If you're taking a time exposure at night, right? Camera's on a tripod, you keep your shutter open for 20 minutes at a time. You never know how long the exposure should be. It's always a trial and error thing. The Olympus is the only camera that allows you to see the cumulative exposure as it's accumulating. So you can know when it's time to terminate the exposure. Smartphones don't do that. On the other hand, smartphones don't need a tripod. So it's a whole other thing. And they can do HDR with tone mapping, just like the cell phones can. So all your high-end cameras are going to be getting this eventually. And here's a case where, you know, I speak so quickly that I'm actually finished before my hour is up. However, that leaves time for me to plug a few things. I did mention earlier that I used to give seminars around the world. Then COVID happened, and we all know what happened about that. Back in 2014, I rented a theater, and we had the seminar professionally videotaped. And then it was edited down to about 6 hours. It's all watchable. So there's now a streaming version of the seminar available for you. The seminar I thought was really important because lots of people know about shutter speeds and f-stops and ISO. A lot of my readers already know about Photoshop, but what they don't know is the secrets that we knew back in the day. Where is it? Once upon a time, there was no such thing as Photoshop. Once upon a time, you either, if you had a vision and you either nailed that vision in the camera or you didn't. No such thing as post-processing. If you wanted to make a living as a professional photographer, you had to know what you were doing. You had to make sure the lighting in your subject fit the dynamic range of your sensor, or in this case, the transparencies, and your light and composition were stellar. Those things are still true, even with digital cameras. And nobody quite understands that. So I spent a lot of time putting the seminar together with the understanding that the forgotten secrets of the Kodachrome shooters are still valid today. Nobody talks about it anymore. I spent a whole day talking about it. And this is a best way to improve photography. Light and composition, and then go talk about the technical stuff later on. And blah, 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 blah. You all know that already. You're members of the Royal Photographic Society if you're crying out loud. If you're interested in it, if you like the way I explain complicated things, it still may be of interest to you. You can go to friedmanarchives.com/seminars. And for the next week, there's a 10% off coupon. just use the coupon code RPS, and you'll be able to enjoy the seminar from the comfort of your home. I also want to talk about the ebooks a little bit. My company makes ebooks in Sony, Olympus, and Fujifilm. And if you go to, let me head over to, this is the Friedman Archives website, and this is my stock image website. Hover over any image. Here's one on wireless flash, my favorite topic. And I license my book. I license my images to book and magazine editors all around the world. These are all done with one, sometimes two wireless flashes. That's about it. On the homepage, you'll see categories for Sony, Fujifilm, and Olympus. Ignore the ones on the right. Minolta's not around anymore. I don't write for Canon anymore for a lot of different reasons. So yeah, and these books are known for being the best and the most thorough, and it's got some humor thrown in there as well. So it makes the learning process a lot more enjoyable. In addition to that, I talked about Cameracraft Magazine, a publication in the UK, and I'm in charge of curating content. I write 1 or 2 articles in every issue, and I try to make them very thoughtful. The most recent one is about remembrance photography. There's a whole army of volunteers in the UK for an organization called Remember My Baby. And they are there to provide free portraiture for newborn babies who are not going to make it home from the hospital. The family is going through the worst time in their lives, and the most valuable thing that they can take home from the hospital, if not the baby, is a professionally done portrait with good glamour lighting and all that, a properly done portrait of the baby while the baby's still alive. If you want to do some good with your photography, this is a great way to go. It's remembermybaby.co.uk. And there's another organization in the US called Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep. And there's a website there as well. It's in my blog, I talk about it more. It's a great organization to volunteer for, and I'm talking way too long about this, but the Cameracraft Magazine articles for me are like the most interesting thing I do, since I haven't been shooting. I haven't been out shooting for the past 2 years, but enough about me. Okay, I've made my plugs. This is officially the end. Thank you very much for, I hope this was very useful to you. We now have about 20 minutes for questions, and you can ask me absolutely anything, except what's the weather like outside in Boston?
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Gary. If you wouldn't mind turning off your screen sharing now. That's
okay.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So now is the time for you to ask Gary your questions. We already have a few, so we can get started with those in a second. If you want to ask Gary any questions, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, or the top if you're possibly using a tablet. If you want to comment on today's event or send your thanks, would you please save that for the survey that we will be sending out in a few days' time. As I said before, questions only today, please. So we'll start with one from Tony, and he says, AI for upres, why does it add a completely different color to the boy's red shirt?
Why does it add information that wasn't there to begin with? That's
a completely different color, apparently.
I can't answer that. I can say that this is one of those unintended consequences of early research. Hopefully, when it finally gets implemented, they won't make such glaring errors, but that's an algorithmic thing.
Okay, thank you. Question from Anne. Do you have any suggestions for a wireless flash? Thank you.
Any suggestions for what?
A wireless flash.
Oh, stick with the brand that is native to your camera manufacturer. So if you shoot with Sony, stick with Sony. The reason for that is the Sony flashes are more reliable. They will trigger more often in iffy situations, and they can do high-speed sync with electronic first curtain shutter without getting banding effects. If you're gonna want to go for a low-cost flash, I highly recommend Godox. Godox isn't quite as reliable, and they will do banding under certain circumstances. If you can put up with that, you can save a third of your money, and Godox flashes are just wonderful. I shoot with 3 of them. They got radio triggers. They're great.
I think in the UK, that's Pixel Pro. I think they import them and read.
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. They go under different brand names depending on the country. In the US, they actually go for Flashpoint. And I think in Europe, there's a brand named Neewer, Neewer, I think.
And I think in the UK it's Pixar Pro.
Okay, could be. And anyway, that's one way to kill your brand, is to subdivide it so there's no brand recognition whatsoever after a while.
Okay, question from Keith. He says, which phone should I buy if I want to cash in?
Cash in, you mean resale value?
I've no idea.
Okay, he probably means to get the best images.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm the ones that are most famous for it are the Apple and the Samsung. There are other Chinese brands whose names escape me. They're not always for sale in every country, and they don't always support the Google Play Store. So a lot of the really best features like Google Maps aren't available for it. So for that reason, those brands are off my radar, and I can't recommend them. So the Google Pixel is the third one. They are known for having the best camera for an Android. The problem with the Pixel is, although the best camera part is true and the best camera algorithms are also quite true, Samsung is really good, and the Google Pixels are known for having the greatest number of bugs in the rest of the phone of any other smartphone, and they can't seem to fix them. Every time they come up with a software update, it fixes some bugs but introduces some new ones. So I stay away from the Google for that reason. Samsung or Apple are the way to go to cash in.
Thank you very much.
That was a long answer.
That's good. Another question from Tony. With the power that computational photography brings, should we be aiming for the truth or convincing lies?
Oh, that is a big, that is a topic for a whole nother lecture. And that has been a topic of debate ever since the camera was around, because after all, you're lying just by not pointing the camera in a certain direction. You're lying by what you're not showing.
No.
Truth. Okay, no such thing as truth. This is always the photographer's perspective and what you choose to show and the story you're trying to tell. And it all comes down to that. And most people, the truth for them is the truth that they remember in their minds. You know, any lawyer can tell you that whenever you're selecting jurors for a jury, people have very poor memories of what actually happened, which means the human brain doesn't place much value on actual truth. It's memories of the truth, or the way you think the truth should have been, or the way you think the world actually is, even though it isn't. So again, that was a long answer, but the high level answer is no such thing as truth, no such thing as relative truth. There is only the story that the photographer wants to tell and how they choose to do it in terms of what they photograph, what lens they choose. You're lying by not choosing a wide angle because you're not showing more information, stuff like that. That's a long answer, but I hope it's satisfactory.
Thank you very much. Question from Nicholas. He says, I've got an iPhone SE. The portrait mode only seemed to work if there's a face in the image. Am I doing something wrong?
No. A lot of the phones will only do portrait mode if it recognizes a face. That will go away. If you read xdadevs.com, I'm a geek at heart, so I go to the technical websites every morning. And I think Google and Samsung are introducing new software as of today, whereas you take a picture after the fact, you can introduce the blur, even though there's no face in the image. And that's going to be happening more and more. It's rolling out, and Apple will pick up on that as well. So right now it's probably face only. In the future, anything.
Okay. Question from Glyn. Gary, do you know if software for older phones, funny if you just answered this, is being updated to embrace the new techniques that you've outlined?
Some are.
Some are.
And when you say older phones, I mean, I have a Galaxy S8 somewhere. Nobody's updating that.
So, fair enough. Okay. Question from Jenny. Do you have a book for the, I should directly to you, do you have a book for the EM1 Mark III?
Yes, it's right behind me. It's one of these. Here it is. EM1 Mark III. Highly rated. I didn't write this. This is written by a outstanding photographer and writer named Tony Phillips. His books from the Olympus and the Fujifilm are the best that there are. So yeah, go to friedmanarchives.com, click on Olympus, and that book will be there. Thank you for asking. I'll pay you later.
Okay. Question from Lois. I've recently bought a Pixel 6, and although the JPEGs are superficially amazing, the post-processing can give a very crunchy result. Yes, I could use RAW, but do you foresee a time when users can choose how much sharpening interpolation is in the results?
I'm going to ask you to repeat the second half of the question again.
Okay. She says, yes, I could use RAW, but do you foresee a time when users can choose how much sharpening and interpolation in the results they put in? So you can choose how much you apply.
The answer is yes. Actually, users can do that now in the bigger cameras. And if you shoot RAW, you can do it post-processing. If you really examine your images that closely, you shouldn't even be thinking about using the smartphones. They're not for you. But yes, in the future, and I believe Sony's going to be the first one to come out with it because they're a big camera company and they're also a smartphone company, even though nobody buys their phones. And to my knowledge, they are not the first ones to do the automatic tone mapping and the HDR stuff. I think they're going to be the last ones to do it because they only cater to serious photographers. But yes, in the future, you'll have as much control over your image as you get with the big cameras now.
Question from G.D. Rothenberg. Which company is furthest ahead in the software?
I'd say it's a three-way tie between Google and Samsung and Apple, and one or two of the Chinese firms whose names escape me.
Okay. Question from Neil. What happens when the sun is behind you? Viewfinders have their uses.
Well, you know, let me just bring out my prop here for a second. When the sun's behind you, classically, that's exactly the way it's supposed to be because your sun's illuminating your subject. Then you can use the sunny F16 rule. And boy, do I sound old by saying that. The sunny F16 rule was used when you didn't have an automatic meter in your camera. Okay.
That's true.
I'm surprised to hear that question because, again, that's a time-honored way to light up your subject. Could it have been this
I have a feeling what he might have been meaning is that basically the viewfinder stops the sun. I'm only guessing. If the sun is behind you, does the sun blot out the effectively the camera screens or the smartphone screen, whereas the viewfinder you can control the amount of light. I'm guessing.
Oh, okay.
Maybe that's what Neil means, is that if the sun's behind you, shining on your smartphone screen.
Oh, it washes out the screen. Yes, it washes. Okay, thank you for that interpretation.
I could be wrong.
I think you're right. It's a problem, and that's why us older folks love the electronic viewfinder because it prevents against that. But yeah, cell phone users, convenience versus ease of use versus quality. It's all a trade-off. And what I usually do, if in case the sun is washing out my screen, believe it or not, I'll hold it closer to my forehead so my head is actually blocking it. Or I'll do this so it blocks it from overhead, which is kind of cumbersome. But again, convenience versus all the other things.
That's a good tip.
That's once I understood it. That's a good question. Thank you.
Okay. Question from Paul. He says, do you have any recommendations for a brand agnostic camera app for Android, which includes multiple exposure functions?
I don't know of any that do multiple exposure.
Fair enough. That was quick. Question from Clive. Do you think when AI gets into cameras that we will have some control over it, or will we be stuck with what the algorithm does?
I believe that Pro Mode will always be available, either from the native software from the manufacturer or a downloadable thing like Photoshop, and that can control your camera also. There will always be a way to shoot unmolestedly.
Okay. Interesting question from Gabriel here. How do you deal with iPhone and filters?
Well, here's where my age and my bias start to show. I hate Instagram filters. Hate, because after all, you go for all the money for all the really big expensive cameras like this one. And how insulting is it to actually take this high quality, high resolution image and crapify it using a stupid filter that all your teenage kids love? So I'm not a fan of filters. What was the question?
It was, how do you deal with iPhone and filters? So is it actually more a case of, can you put a grad on an iPhone? I'm guessing again, maybe I'm misinterpreting the question, but maybe that's what she means, or Gabrielle means, is that if you have an iPhone, you can't put filters on it, or can you?
I believe you can. Well, first of all, if you have Instagram, you can put filters on your images using Instagram. And let me bring up my Android screen here for a second. If I take a picture now, or actually, let me go. Here's a picture I took of my granddaughter and my wife last night. I should be able to edit it by hitting that little pencil icon along the bottom. Can you see that? You can't see. You cannot see the pencil icon on the bottom. All right. Wait a second. Wait a second. Let me turn my phone. Maybe you can see it that way. That's interesting. Okay. It's not mirroring my phone adequately. I'm going to hit the pencil icon and the editing icon. Now you can see some of it. All right. And one of these icons on the bottom, here are some filters you can put on. There's the original, that's auto enhancement. Warms it up by increasing the saturation and adding a lot of yellow. Look at the planes in the background. And you can do a whole bunch of different things. Those are filters. These are not terribly offensive filters. Oh, okay, that one is. Instagram does a really, really horrible job. A lot of people love the black and white filters or the sepia ones. I tend to not do this, again, mostly because of my age. I like the high fidelity. I like the wide dynamic range. And I like to have people say wow to my images by trying to come up with original concept and good light and all that, and not have to rely on the crutch of filters to impress other folks. So I guess the short answer is I try not to deal with them at all.
Okay, fair enough. Oh, just a comment here from Jerry. He said it was nice to see some of his iPhone pictures from the Camera Craft magazine. From Jerry Coe.
Hi, Jerry.
Yay. Viveka, which mobile phone has the best camera in your experience?
Are we talking hardware or software? As I mentioned earlier, the hardware doesn't matter much. They all have good hardware. And again, Apple, Samsung, Google, the hardware is really great. It's the software that in my mind really differentiates them. And any of them will produce outstanding results. I learned a long time ago the folly of trying to do DxO-like reviews of every camera sensor and every smartphone sensor. Yeah, if you pixel peek, this one might be a little bit better if you squint a little bit. That's not how images are used. Any of the cameras on phones nowadays, the high-end phones, will produce remarkable results, and you cannot make a bad choice regarding purchasing of it. You'll be happy with whatever it produces.
Question from Chris, a very simple question. Native camera software or Lightroom mobile?
That's a very personal choice. I know lots of people who love Lightroom mobile because they can finish things and send them off before they even get home. I'm of the age where I invested so much time and energy learning how to use Photoshop, learning how to use Lightroom, that I really prefer doing it at my desktop rather than mobile. I tried the mobile version when it first came out, but in that version, it was so restrictive regarding what features were available that I decided, why bother? And the other thing I can't stand about, while I'm on this rant, the screens for the iPad and any other tablet are much narrower dynamic range. That's the same thing as high contrast. So it looks, when you watch a movie on it, it looks better. Your pictures look better because of the high contrast. It's a narrow dynamic range, which means if you have detail in your shadows of your picture, it's not going to come out. You're not going to see it when you're editing on your iPad. You will see it on your computer monitor, which has a wider range. So for that reason, the lack of features, which may have been fixed by now, and the fact that you're looking at a high contrast version, what you're editing and what you see is not going to be what the final version will look like on somebody with a computer monitor. For those reasons, I don't do it.
Okay. Question from Richard. With a Samsung phone, which camera apps are the best ones to have and why to take and process?
I use the native one, again, because of the ability to do HDR and tone mapping. I have not had a chance to try any of the others, and which means I haven't had a chance to evaluate how well do they do those favorite things that I happen to prefer.
Okay. Question from Michael. I noticed that the teeth on the child and the man with dark hair were both inferior to the real photo. Why is that? Surely the AI should give improved images to feed people's vanity.
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. My answer was the same as the answer I gave earlier. It's prototype, it's research. and they're just trying to see what's possible. And as I showed early on, like technique number 1, where Samsung evaluates a picture looking for faces and tries to smooth over the skin and tries to lighten all the teeth, that's all going to come. I'm sure once Google perfects its ability to up-res it, it'll apply all those things, which we already know how to do later on.
Okay. Question here from C.W. Clark. Are there any good manual info sources for the phone cameras? Any good manuals or info sources?
There is no market for that at all. None. Here's how I know that. Okay, back to this. 750 pages. You have to be an older person in order to be able to sit and plow through it. My camera has so many features. How do I figure this out? Okay, this is not the same demographic as an iPhone user. iPhone users are perfectly happy with the pictures that they take. Perfectly, because it looks the way it looks to their eye. And they can put it to Facebook or Instagram immediately. What is there to learn? Why do I need to burden myself with that? I want to go out and have fun, which I can already do. So I thought about writing such a book. In fact, if you go to Amazon, the Kindle program, there's a 99-cent Kindle book called Ways to Wow with Your Smartphone, which I wrote. It was a condensation of day 1 of the seminar. And the idea was, every sentence was written with less than 144 characters. So my demographic was people who tweet. And the goal was to get the idea across about the lighting composition. 99 cents, it's on the Kindle, ways to wow with your smartphone. And nobody even bought that. So I would say the market for that is 0. And thank you for asking.
Okay. So hang on a minute. I think we already had that. We already had that question about AI gets to cameras having much control over it. So that's been done. Question from Paula. Do you have any intelligence if Sony may put some of the cell phone features onto their bigger cameras?
Sony doesn't talk to me at all. I am not one of their paid artisans. I'm not one of their paid shills. So they don't share any inside information for it. I assume it'll happen with all the manufacturers one day, because they all see what I'm seeing. And they all see what the market is. They don't sell point and shoots anymore. Okay. So it's gonna happen. I just don't know when, and I don't know who's gonna be the first to do it. Well, yes, I do. Olympus.
Fair enough. Question from Mads. Do you know if the image format on the Sony Xperia 5 II can be set to hike the depth map thing? She says in brackets.
I do not know.
No. Okay.
I do not know.
Right.
No experience with it.
Question from Mike. When would you use the iPhone camera app versus the Lightroom camera app on the iPhone?
Well, considering I don't use the camera app. Okay, me personally, I don't use the third-party apps because the native software does such a great job. There's no reason to try another one. So I can't talk.
Okay. Question.
I'm being paid to give a seminar, and I can't talk. I don't use them.
Right, fair enough. Question from Alec. Huawei phones seem to be highly regarded for taking photos. Are they still good, or have they lost their way in the market?
Ask the first sentence again, please.
Huawei phones.
Oh God.
They seem to be highly regarded for taking photos.
They are.
Are they still good, or have they lost their way in the market?
The answer is I don't know, and here's the reason I don't know. First of all, they're pretty much banned in the US, so I can't get my hands on one. Second, they don't have any of the Google software. So if I were to get my own personal phone, I wouldn't get that because I like all the Google features. Their hardware was known to be very, very good, but because I haven't had one in my hands, I can't evaluate the ability to do the tone mapping in the HDR, which again, my favorite features. So again, I don't know.
Okay, thanks for that. Question from Phil. Do you think that these clip-on lenses for smartphones are worth the effort?
No.
No.
Next.
Next. Right, another question from GD Rothenberg. How will computational photography make up for the lack of a telephoto? Will there be a periscope telephoto lens for smartphones?
There might, and that would be a good way to go. But I personally think that the technique that was used in the Light L16, that flat camera with the 16 lenses on it, I think that's the way of the future. And eventually the world will wake up. to that kind of a thing, where the telephoto lens is either embedded there or they have a mirror at 45 degrees. So you can still have a flat phone and a lens, and then the long pipe you need to accommodate the optical path. That I think is going to be the future.
Question from Mark, which basically you've already answered about clip-on lenses. So that's good. Question from Booker. What are your thoughts of Snapseed post-processing for phones, or what other software would you recommend?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it's not something I care to do, just like I don't care for Instagram filters, and that's kind of in the same category. But having those are really, really popular. You know, ask your kid, ask your teenage kids, ask your grandkids if you're my age. That's all they do. That's all they know. So, and you know, they're the ones to ask. They have more experience.
Okay. Question from Richard. Do you know of a slow shutter speed app for Android phones to allow him to do an ICM?
Do I know about the answer is yes. The native software, let me go back to my Android phone here. The native software on the camera, in Pro mode, you can change your shutter speed. Here it's 150, it's 12,000th of a second, which only my Minolta 9XI could do. There's 30 seconds. And apparently there's some software in there that's keeping the highlights from blowing out, because it should be much, much brighter than that.
So do you think that would allow you to do ICM?
What's ICM?
Intentional camera movement. So you get sort of blurred effects with trees and things.
I don't know the answer to that question. And that's the honest answer. I don't know.
I guess the trick is to, if you've got that feature, play with it and find out.
There you go.
Question from Mike. I took a backlit photo of a tree on my iPhone that was amazing. I tried everything to recreate it with tripods, ND filters, tilt shift, and HDR, but never got it as good as the iPhone. Should I give up?
Yes, give up now. There is no correct answer for that. I can tell you that after people listen to this seminar and play with their phone, realizing the tricks that this phone is doing, they leave their big cameras at home much more often. And speaking personally, I'm only using my big cameras in the studio now. I never take it with me anymore. That's how good these are. Should you give up? No. Hang on to your camera, because one day the Smithsonian may want to hang on.
Well, actually, which comes quite nicely onto Lorraine's question, is do you ever see phone cameras taking out the big camera altogether?
No, I see the big cameras catching up. The big cameras will always have an advantage. You know, there's a bell curve for everything, right? And the bell curve is the big cameras will always have an advantage in terms of resolution and enlargeability and ability to shoot sports and subject tracking. And you know, the smaller cameras will catch up and get more and more of those features. But just like 8x10 view cameras have not gone away completely, the big cameras that we use today will not go away completely. They will just be reserved for the real enthusiasts who are serious about their work. And who still shoot film, you know, all that.
Yeah, indeed. Question from Nicholas. When does the phone start to buffer an image? When you go into the camera mode, or when you push the button to take the image?
When you go into camera mode, the minute you turn camera mode on, it's buffering everything you see in the viewfinder. So if you can see it, the camera remembers it for the last second or so.
Okay, well, we come up to the last question, unless any more suddenly turn up while I'm asking this one. The question from one just did. Question from Vincenzo. Can you set 3:2 format on an iPhone? It's not a native format. Maybe some third-party app would help. Do you have any recommendations? Thank you.
You're talking about a 3:2 aspect ratio?
I guess, yeah. Can you set the 3:2 format aspect ratio on an iPhone? It's not native, apparently.
Okay. Well, I don't know about the iPhone. And I'm honestly not sure about this. Oh, here I can shoot 1:1, 9:16 full, or 3:4, which is pretty close to that. Okay, so yeah, on the Android you have some control over aspect ratio. iPhone, I don't know.
Okay,
but no reason you can't crop afterward.
It's true. Yeah,
on your phone.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Okay. Question from Viveka. Gary, when you shared your screen on Zoom, you were in high definition, and now you're in normal Zoom resolution. How did you do that?
Well, I was unaware I was doing high definition, and also I thought I was streaming in high definition also, because what I'm doing here, because with the demo cam, my webcam is a Sony A7R III, which you can see there, and it's being fed plugged into the HDMI, the HDMI port, and it's feeding into this, which is an HDMI to USB converter, and that's going into USB. So my camera is feeding my computer HD all the way. And I was kind of expecting Zoom to carry that over. Sometimes Zoom will downsample to 720p, but I'm surprised that one was HD and one was 720p, and I had no control over any of that.
It may just be a Zoom function that, did you say? Oh, it could be at the other end even.
Yeah, could be.
Okay, well, that does appear to be the last question. Yep, nothing open, so that's good. So Gary, once again, and many thanks. You can see links to Gary's different activities on the screen now, but we'll also include these and the discount code in our follow-up email to you. So don't run off to grab a pen to scribble it all down. This will be coming out to you after we finished in the email. So all that information will be sent across. So thank you very much, Gary. Now on to our advert for our next event. RPS's Digital Imaging is very glad that you joined us for this event, so thanks for coming along. This is Digital Imaging's 30th online event, and we now have many more in the pipeline. As we've said in the past, if you're not already a member, you will find that even though the fee for non-members is low, if you are an RPS member, you will probably save money by joining Digital Imaging as a digital-only member. Oh, just a little point there, Gary. We've had a few people coming in saying, you know, interesting, very interesting, great show. So I say you'll get probably a lot of those from the feedback as well. Okay, so thank you. Anyway, our next online event will be a talk by Sharon Prenton-Jones called Portraits, Myths and Fairy Tales. This will be on Saturday, April the 9th, same time, same place. So in the meantime, stay well, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Cheerio.
Thank you, Trevor. Thanks
Gary.
for joining.
Thanks. Bye.